national security and corruption. We're going to have our moderator today be Dina Temple-Raston. She's now an investigative... Oh, I know that's her new title. She's got a new title since this changed. My camera, the record, I think it is. We've got Daniel Eriksson, should be up live shortly. He's the CEO of Transparency International. Jane Harman, who's a distinguished fellow and president emerita at the Wilson Center. And Juan Zarate, who's the chairman for the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. You're all most welcome to the stage. Thank you very much.
You go in the middle, Jane.
So I'll sit here. You sit there. Here, either way.
Just in the middle.
Rose between two thorns. I'm the thorn. Yes. Is this on? Can you hear me? Not on yet. Is it on? No. I can project, but not that well. There you go. Hi. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and we've got Daniel behind me. That's awesome. And we only have a half an hour to cover all the corruption in the world, so we're going to go as quickly as we can to take care of that. I actually wanted to start with Daniel, who is the CEO of Transparency International, which, for those who aren't familiar, is a civil society organization leading the fight against corruption. And then we'll touch briefly on Afghanistan, which we could actually spend hours on, but we're only going to touch on that briefly. And then we're going to move along to discuss whether or not there are things in terms of technology, like cryptocurrency, rather surprisingly, that might be able to help us fight corruption. Someone, okay, so you can hear me just fine? That's great. Okay, so Daniel, let me start with you. I'm going to look at you down here. I want to ask you about the Pandora Papers. I think for some reason the Panama Papers have sort of created something in our imaginations more than the Pandora Papers, even though I think twice as many politicians and people were actually implicated in the Pandora Papers. So could you just give us a little bit of the highlight of what was revealed there, aside from the fact that let's just say, paramour of Vladimir Putin's is living in a nice house in Monte Carlo? If you could go ahead, or Monaco, I can't remember. Yeah, if you could go ahead. Someone, okay, yeah. So you can hear me just fine?
First of all, thanks for having me.
So Daniel, let me start with you. I'm going to look at you down here.
The Pandora Papers is just another...
Panama Papers have sort of created something in our imaginations more than the Pandora Papers, even though I think twice as many politicians and people were actually implicated in the Pandora Papers. So could you just give us a little bit of the highlight of what was revealed there, aside from the fact that let's just say, paramour of Vladimir Putin is living in a nice house in Monte Carlo?
Those kinds of users of these kinds of shell companies.
I did all that without moving my lips. Let's see if we can actually get Daniel just a moment. Now, can you try, Daniel, and I'll just be quiet. Maybe there won't be an echo that way.
Okay, I didn't know there was an echo. Okay. So did you hear me?
Now you're perfect. I'll just be quiet.
I'm perfect. I will try to speak perfectly as well. Thank you very much, Dina. So what I do find with the Pandora Papers, which is, let's say in terms of size, 10% bigger than the Panama Papers, but still in many ways bigger, and we're still trawling through all of that data and information. I wish more would be done on a policy-making level to learn from these and try to get to the root causes of what is happening therein, and not getting stuck on the headlines on these regrettable tax evasion and activities of some world leaders, and instead going for those activities that are threatening democracy all over the world.
And do you find now that there's been a little bit of passage of time, that there are those policy changes that are taking place? Do you see any sort of hopeful hints that there will be change?
I don't think enough time has passed. However, I mean, there's still actions being taken following the Panama Papers and the FATF recommendations, the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, coming out now with requirements of beneficial ownership transparency or beneficial ownership registers in countries, that is a substantial step forward. But there's much more that needs to be done, and more has to be learned from this particular release with the Pandora Papers as well. And there's other areas such as, I mean, in the US where you are now, the real estate industry, which is being used widely by kleptocrats all over the world as an investment area. While the US is fighting for democracy across the world, it's benefiting financially, taking home those who are fighting against democracy. It's a paradox.
And then there's the bastion of evilness, South Dakota and Nevada, which has its own sort of secret crimes. Could you talk a little bit about that, about what people are doing in those two states? I was surprised to read that.
Yeah, it is true. I'm not a domestic US expert, and we have a team working on those specific issues, but in the US there are certain states which have a much more lax attitude towards shell company use and financial secrecy and anonymity, which makes those areas specifically interesting for those who have large amount of cash that they want to hide away.
So let me just touch on one more thing before we move on to Jane in Afghanistan, and that has to do with this idea of 5 key elements that Transparency International has come out with that you think will help with this whole corruption issue.
Yeah, I mean, I won't go into to bore everyone in the details with all of these requirements, but already what I mentioned with regards to the FATF, the beneficial ownership registers for countries to make whatever they can do to ensure that anonymous shell companies are not a thing that we accept anymore. There is little or no good legal use for a shell company, and companies should legislate against them, and where that is not possible, set up registries to make it clear who is behind shell companies. There is also then the issues with bearer shares, meaning paper documents that makes a company, the owner of a company is the one that holds the document. As you can imagine then, it's really easy to transfer ownership of a company from one individual to another. That kind of methodology should not be accepted anywhere. And I'd also like to mention in general the issue of foreign companies and the need for Western democracies to ensure that when foreign companies comes in with investments, like I mentioned early on with, for instance, real estate or other private investments, that those companies are put under the same scrutiny as one would domestically in terms of ensuring that one knows who are the real individuals behind these companies. These are 3 examples of very clear activities, actions that could be taken in order to reduce the risks. And I understand in a country like the US that there's challenges with state laws and so forth, but really the world does not need shell companies, and we need to do more to combat them.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I love South Dakota and Nevada. I was kidding, in case that didn't come off as sarcasm, which is sometimes doesn't come out in a transcript. So when we've been talking about corruption lately, Jane, we've been focusing on Afghanistan and what's gone wrong there. And I don't want to dwell on this too long, because there's corruption everywhere, not just in Afghanistan. But it is a good example of corruption becoming a tool of statecraft, and this affects national security. Right. So John Sopko, who is the latest IG for Afghanistan reconstruction, he said on NPR recently that a lot of information about American money flows in Afghanistan were classified to protect the Afghan government from embarrassment. Shall we just declassify those?
Well, I don't know. I mean, classification done right protects sources and methods, and there may be some reasons not to do that. But should we not have a debate about whether feeding kleptocracies or starting kleptocracies is good or bad for America's future? Yeah, I think we should have that. If I could just say a few things, and
Please.
I do want to talk about Afghanistan. First of all, I think this is a great topic to put on the agenda for the Aspen Security Forum. It's an unusual topic to focus on, and you're the best moderator possible, Dina, so there. Also, Transparency International has done extraordinary work, so kudos to you. But I do think that the Pandora Papers gave the impression that everybody on the list was a corrupt and bad person, and I don't think that's really fair. Maybe shell companies are bad, But for example, one name I am familiar with was the King of Jordan, who, so far as I know, and I didn't do detailed research, but certainly it's his claim, the money he spent on real estate in the U.S. was his personal money. It wasn't embezzled or payoffs from folks in Jordan. It certainly, the contrast between his wealth and the wealth of his citizens is there, but I think maybe you didn't, but somebody gave the impression that every person on the list was in some way corrupt. On Afghanistan, here's the difference. There's corruption all over the world. There's endemic corruption all over the world. I know part of our adventures and misadventures in Ukraine are that we keep bumping up against corruption. But in Afghanistan, my experience, and I was in Congress at the time, and I was really enraged by this, is we fed the corruption. We, the United States of America, fed the corruption and enabled a huge part of the kleptocracy that in the end not only undermined our effectiveness, but undermined, I think, our credibility. And we criticize others, but oops, what did we do? And
the theory behind that was if we pay warlords, then they'll have peace. I think there was a theory.
The theory was,
theory?
remember, clear, hold, build. We cleared places to hold them. We thought, not me personally, but those prosecuting the war effort in Afghanistan, and to remind, for the first term of Bush 43, Congress was basically cut out of the loop. I've just written a book on this subject. But they thought that paying the warlords to keep the peace was the way to hold the gains that we had made. And so one of those was a guy named Walid Karzai, who was the brother of the then leader of Afghanistan, Hamid Karzai. And he was in Kandahar. He was in Kandahar. I don't know how big the suitcases were transferring the money, but we paid this guy ransoms, and he and others used this money to some extent for self-enrichment. And if you go to Dubai, as you drive from the airport to downtown Dubai, you see all these McMansions along the road, which were built with U.S. money given to Afghan warlords and other folk. And I found this then appalling, and I complained about it and basically got nowhere. The other thing I would say is that we did undermine our effectiveness there, and no one will defend exactly how we implemented the decision to get out of the country, to get out of the war mission last summer, but that mission was hobbled, I think, by the fact that the corruption was so rampant. The troops in Afghanistan were not being paid because their payments were being skimmed off, and they figured out as soon as we announced a firm date for departure that if they wanted to survive, and especially since they weren't being paid, they might as well go over to the other side. And just one more sad fact, I think it is a fact. I have great admiration for someone named Sarah Chase, who some of you know, worked for NPR.
She was at NPR.
Lived in Afghanistan for years running a small company, a soap factory in Kandahar, then helped our military mission, and has written 3 books, I think, but also wrote a letter, I guess she self-published it in August, about her despair because she had finally figured out that Hamid Karzai, on the front end of this, according to Sarah, negotiated the return of the Taliban after the Russians left. And she claims, and I don't know if this is factual, that he was again involved just now in negotiating the return of the Taliban. And think of that as bookends in a time period where we gave so much treasure and blood to try to change Afghanistan. And I think it's just an appallingly dismal fact, if it is in fact true.
So against that backdrop, Juan, if you talk about corruption as an integral part of national security, which clearly we see in this particular case in Afghanistan, how do we fix this?
Yeah. First of all, Dina, thank you for having me, and I'm honored to be on this panel, and thank you to everybody who's done work in the space. What's interesting about the program and strategy of anti-corruption, as we're talking about it here, is I think there's more and more of a recognition that it plays a core role in national security, right? To hear Jane describe what she did is to say, look, our mission in a war zone to rebuild the country is completely undermined. Not to mention the fact that the Taliban was profiting from some of this as well. So our enemy itself was actually profiting. But I think the way to think about this, and the reason we're having this conversation, is there's a recognition that corruption around the world, especially kleptocracy, exacerbates and amplifies all the national security threats we worry about. And it enables and profits and empowers America's enemies to undermine US interests and influence, right? So if you look at any of the issues, you talk about Afghanistan, corruption is a core question. You look at the challenge of Iran and their ability to operate, the clerical regime to operate, the use of boneyards in corruption. They're able to skim and profit and to enable their regime. You look at the Venezuelan regime, the Maduro regime, which is in essence a criminal regime, which is destroying the environment and making deals with the devil and doing all the rest. You know, across the board, corruption is a threat to how we think about how the world should operate, and certainly the standards and norms that we want to live by. And certainly episodes like Afghanistan undercut our credibility, which is deeply damaging. But if you look at the challenge from China, you look at the challenge from Russia, you look at the nefarious actors around the world that want to undermine US power and interest, they are using tools of corruption and kleptocracy to enable their activities. That then makes everything that Daniel talked about, all these systemic issues that geeks like us from the Treasury Department always screamed about, transparency, the need for corporate registries, the need for understanding who's owning property or investing in technology in the US. That transparency is really important. And I think that's exactly what Transparency International and Daniel was talking about. And I think that's why you have the Biden administration now saying and asking for a government review of how do we think about anti-corruption as a strategic element of our posture internationally and our national security. And I happen to think, I'm an optimist here, I happen to think this is a huge comparative advantage for the United States. The more that we drive transparency, the harder it is for the bad actors to operate around the world. The more that we drive for standards and principles for how you do business in a credible way, the more US companies and Western institutions are on a level playing field. The more that we expose where kleptocrats are paying bribes or embedding themselves or entangling countries in debt diplomacy, the more we're able to then compete or challenge on a diplomatic basis. So,
as the Secretary said, Secretary Rice said this morning that she called the Belt and Road Initiative, if you remember, a loan and own initiative, and that people were starting to push back from that.
That's exactly right.
That's what you're talking about.
Absolutely right. And it becomes, it's not the only thing that you do to challenge China, but China is now struggling, and you see this, and we just heard this with the exit of Yahoo and the challenge of LinkedIn, how they control data and technology. Right. China is now struggling with the fact that they are dealing with an international system that demands certain degrees of transparency and operations that are uncomfortable for China. Now with their state-owned enterprises operating well outside the boundaries of Chinese borders, it's harder and harder for them to control that, and they're reacting to it. And I think this is a strategic moment for all of us to recommit to principles that we believe in, transparency, traceability, accountability, and then driving this through our strategy because it plays to our advantages. And I think that's why this has to be part of a broader national security strategy.
So one of the things I'm doing now, so I'm a senior correspondent at The Record, which is a new cyber and intelligence news service. And one of the things we're looking at, for example, for transparency, rather illogically, it seems like on the face, is cryptocurrency, which I know that you do a lot of. And Daniel, I know in your last iteration at Transparency International, you were doing a lot of technology. Could you, I'll go to Daniel and then you, could you speak just briefly how this thing that we think of as cryptocurrency being, you know, anonymizing things and used for criminal enterprises, how it could actually help battle corruption?
Yeah, pleasure. It also depends on the ledger of the coinage in question. So there's certain cryptocurrencies that are made with maximum anonymity that actually facilitate activities of the corrupt or criminals, whatever it might be. But let's say that a country would decide to set up a cryptocurrency with an open ledger, or at least a ledger that the government itself could read. Well, then you could actually see how that cash had been used once it has been issued. So, and those kind of currencies could be set up for specific purposes. It doesn't have to replace regular fiat currency, but it could be a way of fighting corruption of certain kinds.
And they did this in Venezuela, isn't that right?
They did. Full disclosure, I've been an advisor to Coinbase since 2014. So just
I didn't bring that up for
full
that reason.
disclosure.
Okay.
But absolutely right. And I think more and more policymakers are recognizing that the technology can square the circle of these problems, which is in Venezuela, you have a currency that's worthless, you have a government that's corrupt, you have a sanctions and anti-money laundering regime that is very restrictive, but people need resources, they need food, they need access. And so crypto is actually being used by NGOs to facilitate what are in essence peer-to-peer transfers, to do what Daniel described, which is to understand who's sending, who's receiving, to understand those channels, to take the central government out of this. And so what this does is it holds the promise of new payment channels that are more transparent, more useful, don't add to the corruption, and frankly don't enable and empower the central government, as we've seen with Cuba, for example, which skims from all the remittances sent from the Cuban Americans back to their families like mine in Cuba. So it's a hopeful technology. Not all technologies are the same, though, in the crypto domain.
Could I just, as the digital adapter here who understands one sentence of what Juan just said, pose a concern? I just think, as they say in the law, this is a slippery slope. And there's all the dark money that fuels the terrorists.
Yep.
And to do this right might be an aspiration. Maybe it's even achievable. But I can just see how it would itself would get corrupted and be even harder to trace. And I just want to make one other point. In Afghanistan, for a while, I think, we were paying the soldiers through payments directly to their cell phones.
To their phones.
Yeah. And a lot of banking in Africa is done that way. And that cut out the Karzai corruption, or I think it did for a while. I think we ended up stopping that, which was a mistake. But again, if you're talking about paying soldiers, let's just imagine if we're on a military mission someplace. I don't know how you avoid the government and do some closed loop crypto thing. So I think unless Juan is in charge of it, we ought to be very careful.
Well, the idea is that at least it's a new way to look at this, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have a lot of time left, but we're going to try and take, I got you, don't worry. We're going to try and take some questions. If someone could bring a microphone to this person in the red up front,
Trudy
please.
Rubin of the Philadelphia Inquirer, Smith College graduate.
Thanks, Jane.
Wow.
As I listen to all of this, I have to ask, is it deeply hypocritical for the United States to talk about curbing corruption when USAID is a funnel for corruption? Anyone who covered Iraq or Afghanistan at length, including myself, saw the most disgusting corruption, and it wasn't just to warlords. USAID gave up its ability to work by itself with experts and goes through beltway bandits.
Could you ask your question? Sorry.
The question is, if you don't get rid of the system of beltway bandits, are we not hypocrites in even talking as the U.S. about curbing corruption?
Okay. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely right, and you can't cede control the way you described, and I think Iraq and Afghanistan had the worst of all attributes. You had a ton of money going in, a war zone, lots of chaos, lots of actors, lots of beltway bandits, all the rest. So I think you're absolutely right. It is essential for the United States to continue to drive this, though. There is no other country that has the moral voice or the enforcement toolkit to apply to this. We have the Global Magnitsky Act So over 230 individuals designated for human rights and corruption per year over the last 5 years. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the most aggressive criminal law in place. In fact, Sepp Blatter was just indicted today by Swiss authorities because of a Department of Justice investigation started 5 years ago. And it's the U.S. that is a standard setter still. So I couldn't agree with you more. And if we're not practicing what we preach, we lose the ability to have anti-corruption as a strategic tool.
So I apologize that we have so little time, but what I do want to say in 3 different ways is, first of all, take a look at the Pandora Papers and see what's really there. A lot of journalists glommed on to sort of the sexy headlines, but there's some very interesting details there, and I think that's still going to come out. Jane has a book coming out, and what's the title?
Did have a book. I mean, it's already out.
It's already out.
Insanity Defense: Why Our Failure to Confront Hard National Security Problems Makes Us Less Safe.
And lastly, for Juan, if you have not read Treasury's War, which was all about brogues on the ground, that he was doing, that's also, if this is something that interests you, this will give you all a really good sort of primer on all of this. And I'm sorry that we had to be so brief, but I hope this will inspire you to look a little bit more at how corruption as national security can be married better than they are right now. Thanks very much. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Dina.
Thanks, Dina.
Yeah.